Yes, thank you very much. I'm super glad to announce that we could get Edgar Solomonik, an SPCL alumni who's now heading the LPNA group at CS at Illinois as a professor, to give us a presentation today. And Nikolai has a short introduction on Edgar, I believe. So,
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Torsten. And as Torsten said, I'm happy to welcome Edgar as our SPCL BCAS speaker for today. Edgar is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's won more awards than I have time to list, but some notable ones include the Householder Prize, and I think his most recent is an NSF Career Award. Congratulations on that. He also develops open source software for high performance tensor operations, including the Cyclops tensor framework, CTF, and I'll let Edgar take it away.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, Nikolai and Torsten, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be at least virtually back in Zurich. Today I want to talk about the work our group has been doing in the tensor computations sphere, both in algorithms and systems. This is kind of a subset of what our group does as a whole. So we also work on parallel algorithms for matrix factorizations, as well as some combinatorial problems such as graph algorithms and sorting. Within tensor computations, we've spent quite a bit of time looking at how to do tensor decompositions faster, how to accelerate tensor operations in the presence of tensor sparsity, and how to do tensor completion, which in a sense is a variation of tensor decomposition. A different domain that I will also talk about today is tensor networks, which in a sense leverage tensor decompositions without explicitly working with a large tensor. And these are quite important for simulation of quantum systems, and I'll say a little bit about that. And we've also been working a bit on fast bilinear algorithms. Bilinear algorithms actually can be thought of as tensor decompositions of tensors that define a particular bilinear problem, such as matrix multiplication or convolution. And we have a recent survey on how we can view convolution algorithms through this bilinear algorithm lens. And also we have some new fast bilinear algorithms for tensor contractions in the presence of permutational group symmetry, which I will briefly mention during this talk as well. So much of the work today that I will talk about has been led by students within our research group, which is the Laboratory for Parallel Numerical Algorithms, LPNA. Here's a picture of us that's now maybe a year and a half or so old. Here's kind of the current PhD students in the group. Actually, we also have one that just joined, Mina-san. And for kind of more, please see our webpage to check out papers as well as learn more about what our group is working on. Okay, so to start with, let me talk a little bit about what a tensor is. And also to establish some terminology. So I'll refer to, in a sense, the number of dimensions in a tensor as the order and not the dimension. So if you think about a 2D dimensional array, so two-dimensional array or three-dimensional array, I'll say that's a second order tensor or a third order tensor. And its dimensions are the size of each of its modes. So perhaps a 3D array would be n by m by k, and those would be the dimensions here. Throughout the talk, I'll use the letter S to denote the dimension, and I'll typically assume the dimensions are equal. Of course, they might not be in practice. So a scalar is an example of a tensor of order 0. And we can also associate kind of a graph or a tensor diagram with it, which is just a circle with no legs pointing out of it. While for a vector, we can think of it as an order 1 tensor, and now we'll have one leg pointing out of this circle. We'll use these tensor diagrams later to construct tensor contractions and describe different methods in a graphical way. With a matrix, we have an order 2 tensor, and that can be written as this circle with 2 legs sticking out. An order 3 tensor is the same thing, and I kind of like to think about these diagrams as naturally arising from these pictures of cubes or hypercubes, because if you look at a vertex, the number of edges it's adjacent to is exactly this number of legs 3. So somehow these little diagrams sum up the dimensionality of the object. So the basis of much of tensor computations is the contraction of 2 tensors or more. So a simple example of a tensor contraction is matrix multiplication. And we can write a little graphical diagram to represent matrix multiplication. In matrix multiplication, if we multiply A by B, we're summing over one mode, one index K, and 2 of the modes become output modes. So the tensor diagram we will use to denote this little operation is this one here, where this internal leg is being summed over. And we know that because it kind of doesn't point into space, while these I and j legs point into white space. So they become modes of the output and are not summed over. So a different operation that, at least I also think of as a tensor contraction, is the Hadamard product, where we actually don't sum anything. We simply multiply elements kind of in a one-to-one manner, so in a pointwise manner. And this can also be written as a tensor diagram a little bit more awkwardly. So here we'll combine these legs into the leg I and these legs into the leg j, so that these become outer legs. With the important thing being that j and I point into outer space so that they're not being summed over. And so this leg is in a sense a single index. There's a lot of nice things about this diagram representation. One thing is that eventually we can drop the subscripts I and j. They don't really matter. They're simply labels. And the connectivity of the diagram describes what's going on. Another nice thing is that if we simply count the number of edges, number of legs, that tells us the asymptotic complexity of the operation. So here we have 3 legs, which means that matrix multiplication is order n cubed. Here we have 2 legs, which means the Hadamard product requires n squared operations. Whoops. So let's then talk a little bit about what we can do with higher order tensors. Let's just do order 3. But both of these operations will generalize to arbitrary order. One of the perhaps most basic things we can do is to multiply a tensor by a matrix to get back a tensor. So here we want to connect the tensor with one leg with a matrix, and this connected internal leg will be summed over to produce a new leg for the output tensor. So this is an example of a tensor contraction that's not a simple matrix operation. So a kind of more ubiquitous within tensor computation literature operation is the MTT-KRP, the matricized tensor times Cauchy-Rao product. I won't actually use this terminology of Cauchy-Rao products or matricizations much during the talk, but it's another way of viewing what this operation is doing. But from a kind of a tensor contraction point of view, what we're really doing is taking a tensor T that's order 3 and contracting it along all except one mode with a factor matrix for each mode, such that the second leg of these factor matrices, V and W, and I quickly jump to the word factor matrices because within tensor decompositions, this operation will arise and we will be multiplying a tensor by the matrices that are its factors in that decomposition. But for now, we can just think about these as matrices. And what we're doing here is kind of contracting along one mode and then combining the remaining mode, this second one, and not summing over it. It points into outer space. So this MTT-KRP operation is interesting in a number of ways. It's kind of dominates the cost of a number of really important methods for tensor decompositions. And while kind of it seems that a subset of it is this TTM. So if we just multiply T by V, we would be doing a TTM, and then we could take the result and multiply it by W. So that would be kind of placing a parentheses around T and V. It turns out that MTT-KRP is actually faster often than a TTM. So if you actually implement this kind of more complicated operation, you can reduce communication costs and better exploit sparsity in T than in this TTM, which is an interesting kind of general feature and complication that arises with tensor computations, is that often you actually need to look at a multi-tensor expression and contract it all at once, as opposed to simply placing parentheses and contracting pairs of tensors at a time, which is typically what we do in the matrix computations world. Okay, so that's a little kind of primer on tensor contractions. Let's now talk a little bit about kind of the inverse operation, tensor decomposition. With the tensor decomposition, we want to write a tensor as a contraction of smaller tensors. And this is useful for a number of reasons. It allows us to perhaps compress the size of T into these smaller sized matrices. And it also sometimes allows us to learn information about T, as well as to operate on T more efficiently later. The most widely used and best known tensor decomposition is the canonical polyadic, otherwise in literature called CanDecomp para-fac, or just briefly CP tensor decomposition. And here we want to model a tensor in a way that tries to generalize what happens with lower rank matrix factorizations. So here we have a single index ranging from r equals 1 to big R, where big R will be our notion of rank. And what we're really doing is writing T as a sum of kind of outer products of columns of factor matrices A, B, and C. We can also write this as a tensor diagram, where here I use SumR to remind everyone that kind of an index that doesn't go into outer space should be summed over. So this index here is summed. And these I, J, and K indices map to the output tensor. And so this decomposition actually is quite difficult to compute because of this index that couples three-factor matrices. It turns out that this is kind of a nonlinearity in a sense that is difficult to resolve. An alternative model that we'll also talk about today to a lesser degree is the tensor train or matrix product state factorization of a tensor, where we take a tensor and we express it as a chain of products of matrices or tensors. So actually B here is an order 3 tensor, while A and C are order 2. And if we were to have higher order tensor that we're factorizing, we would add more factors and they would kind of look like this train. So it's a chain where every tensor is connected to the one next to it. And kind of similarly here, if we want to make T higher order, we would add more factor matrices and connect them all to the SumR index. So in both of these cases, we're kind of taking an arbitrary order tensor and writing it in terms of, for the CP case, order 2 tensors, so matrices, while for the tensor train case, order 2 or 3 tensors. So in both cases, these are much smaller unless these ranks are particularly high. And they can be high. So this rank can actually be bigger than the dimension of this mode. And it would still be a low rank tensor decomposition because the maximal rank for the order 3 case is like the product of 2 of the modes. Since then the number of degrees of freedom on the right-hand side here is the same as on the left-hand side. So kind of generalizing this notion of a matrix product state, which in a sense one can think of as a 1D tensor network, to higher dimensions, we get what's called the projected entangled pair states, or simply let's call it a 2D tensor network, where again, each one of these factors has one leg that represents an output leg, often called a physical leg, and legs that connect it to neighbors on a 2D lattice, which are bond dimensions, or kind of rank legs or internal legs that are summed. These tensor networks are quite common within the broader field of tensor network methods, where we never actually work with this T explicitly. We only work with this representation as a 1D or 2D tensor network. While CP decomposition most often arises in the context when we're given a tensor T and we wish to decompose it to either learn a little bit about it or to get kind of a reduced size approximation to it. So within tensor networks, as I mentioned, what we typically want to do is not to factorize a tensor, but to kind of optimize a already factorized tensor network. So I wanted to kind of give an example here of one of the most important tensor network methods. Here we will represent some kind of state, which is a kind of a quantum state in this density matrix normalization group algorithm, DMRG, as psi. And this is just this big tensor train. And then we'll also define an operator on that state that's also a tensor train, but has 2 outgoing legs. And the idea here is that now we can take H and multiply it by psi. And when I say multiply, I mean connect each one of these legs to each one of the lower legs. And then if we could contract that and actually get something that looks like psi again. And this operation is really a matrix vector product. So H is in some sense a factorized matrix, and psi is in some sense a factorized vector. And our goal within DMRG is to optimize psi so that psi approximates an eigenvector of H. In particular, DMRG typically looks for the smallest eigenvalue of H, which, if H is a Hamiltonian, defines the ground state energy of the system that H is kind of describing. And so by using kind of this representation for H and psi, we're able to work with kind of an exponentially smaller reduced size system that models kind of this exponential state space of a quantum system. And the way that DMRG then actually works is by kind of alternating among these sites of psi, the tensors that arise within the tensor factors within psi, and optimizing each one of them at a time by projecting this overall eigenvalue problem to a reduced eigenvalue problem, where everything in these red boxes is contracted and is called the environment. And what we're doing is solving for a pair of sites at a time, which is here this orange block. and then factorizing that pair to get two independent sites. Oops. So that's that should give you some idea of what these tensor network algorithms look like. So notice here that we never actually had a tensor that's of size kind of number of sites, or d to the power of the number of sites, but we only worked with things that were already factorized. Although in the process of doing contractions here, we'll often have to kind of recompress so that the bond dimensions don't grow. Okay, and I'll get back to tensor network methods and some of the things that we're doing in the sphere a little bit later in the talk. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about the spectrum of applications for tensor decompositions, tensor networks, and tensor contractions. So tensor decompositions have a couple of different uses, which also differ in how the computational problems that result. One use is to try to kind of analyze a kind of high order, usually very sparse data set in order to do things like clustering or to kind of learn about principal components, in some sense higher order principal components of this data set. So this is typically done by something like a CP decomposition with a very low rank, so maybe like rank 10, when the tensor might be million by million by million. And it's often augmented with constraints. So we don't necessarily just want to compute a CP decomposition. We might want a CP decomposition where all the factor matrices are positive, because we might be modeling a probability distribution, or we might want the factor matrices to be close to orthogonal if we want to do higher order clustering. So these problems also have a bit of their own flavor. Another thing that often occurs is if we have a kind of a large data set or some large tensor that we compute as an intermediate, and we want to compress it to a smaller size to just save memory footprint or disk space, or to be able to compute subsequent operations faster. And examples of where this arises are the use of tensor decompositions to compress sites within kind of weight matrices within a neural network, as well as within quantum chemistry, where tensors describing two electron interactions can be compressed using CP decomposition to actually accelerate asymptotically methods that try to model the electronic structure of systems. And a kind of very peculiar application that I really like is the fact that you can actually use CP decomposition to discover new algorithms. So bilinear problems, so things like matrix multiplication and convolution, can be described by an order 3 tensor, and algorithms correspond to exact CP decompositions of that tensor. So for example, the well-known Strasson's algorithm for matrix multiplication, which is subcubic in cost, can be thought of as a CP decomposition of a 4 by 4 by 4 tensor of rank 7. For even kind of 9 by 9 by 9 tensors that represent the 3 by 3 matrix multiplication problem, we don't know the optimal CPU rank. So that's still an open problem. So tensor decompositions, even for very small tensors, can be extremely hard problems. In a sense, not just NP hard, but we can't even really search over an exponential space of solutions. So that's kind of tensor decompositions and their applications. In the tensor networks sphere, we're typically solving eigenvalue problems, linear systems, or least squares problems, where the equations, as well as kind of the vector for which we're solving, as well as the right-hand sides, are all represented themselves as tensor networks. So all of these kind of vectors and matrices are thought of as much higher order tensors, and then factorized in kind of that representation. So these types of methods are very widely used in condensed matter physics and quantum chemistry whenever we want to model systems consisting of spins or electrons or qubits. So we'll also talk a little bit about how tensor networks can be used to simulate quantum circuits later in this talk. And finally, tensor contractions, which are kind of more basic than tensor networks and tensor decompositions, are first of all prevalent within these subspheres of methods, but they also kind of are important in their own right. So there are methods in quantum chemistry, such as coupled cluster, which essentially consist of hundreds or tons of contractions of higher order tensors. And the contractions come in all types of flavors. And so optimizing those is an open and important problem in that domain. And typically here, the tensors will have symmetries associated with physical symmetries in the system, conservation laws, and things like that, as well as permutational symmetry. So in this domain, it's actually quite important to exploit symmetry to reduce cost. And I'll talk a little bit about how we can do that in tensor contractions. Okay, and so then I wanted to kind of show this in a pictorial view. which is perhaps more confusing given the number of arrows I drew here. But also I wanted to here kind of summarize some of the systems efforts that I will talk about during this talk. So the applications can kind of be subdivided into the following domains: quantum circuit simulation, condensed matter physics, quantum chemistry, data analysis, and graph processing. With the graph processing being something that I won't talk much about today. But actually, many graph algorithms can be thought of in a convenient way algebraically, and actually some of these contraction of multiple tensors at once ideas pop up in graph algorithms when done algebraically. But our focus today will be on tensor decomposition methods, as well as tensor completion, which is a flavor of tensor decomposition, and tensor network simulation. And much of our effort is kind of at the interface of how these methods look like at a high level and the underlying kind of low-level hardware stack. So kind of our HPC system and the things that allow us to actually use it reasonably efficiently for linear algebra and tensor algebra, such as low-level libraries such as scale-up and MKL, as well as tensor transposition libraries such as HPTT. And what everything kind of will be based on in order to interface to HPC systems is the Cyclops tensor framework library, which is something that's been developed for now 10 plus years, and is a C++ library for dense and sparse tensor contractions that also, since as of 3 or 4 years, has a Python interface, which now we've developed new libraries which are kind of based on this higher level Python interface. And the new libraries are yet more higher level. So we want to go beyond this abstraction of tensor contractions or even multi-tensor contractions to things that allow us to quickly implement tensor decomposition methods, quickly implement tensor network simulations, and so forth. And there's kind of 2 tools I will talk about today that we've developed. One is called AutoHoot, automatic high-order optimization for tensors. And this is a library to do automatic differentiation and automatic optimization of tensor expressions so as to minimize cost, which kind of needs to be done if you want to do automatic differentiation well. And it turns out that AutoHoot is much, much better for these domains of methods than alternative things like JAX and TensorFlow. Another library I'll talk about today is Koala, which is tries to kind of provide a nice interface as well as an efficient underlying infrastructure for simulation of tensor network states. So here we start with some kind of tensor network and we evolve it over time by applying operators on sites or pairs of sites within, or pairs of factor matrices within the tensor network. And we've used this to kind of implement approximate simulations of quantum circuits via the kind of some nice high-level abstractions and more efficient underlying algorithms. But I also want to talk about some of the ideas that we have regarding algorithms which are perhaps a little bit above this level of automatic differentiation and libraries. So these are kind of somewhat higher level ideas about how we can actually accelerate tensor decompositions and tensor networks. And then I will go in and talk about how we build these software abstractions under them. I'll note here the graph processing is pointing to the C++ interface, not the Python interface of CTF, because for graphs, one thing that Cyclops provides are kind of templated element-wise functions, as well as kind of templated tensor type element types, which are very useful if you want to implement algebraic graph algorithms. But such templating is not really possible to be interfaced to Python. So we, at this point, aren't doing much graph processing with Cyclops at the Python level, although for numerics, much of everything is now being done in Python. Okay. So let's then talk a little bit about tensor decomposition algorithms. A tensor of order n has, I guess we talked over this terminology a little bit already, it has dimensions s by s by s. So this CP decomposition that I mentioned can be written for an order 3 tensor as the sum of outer products, each one of which is a column in a factor matrix. So one factor matrix contains these vectors A1 through AR, another C1 through CR, and another B1 through BR. The most widely used algorithm for this decomposition is the alternating least squares approach, which fixes all of the B vectors and all of the C vectors and optimizes for the best choice of A. Then it alternates and fixes all the A and C vectors and chooses the best sets of B vectors, and then goes to C and then rotates back around to A. Each one of these subproblems will be a quadratic optimization problem, since we only have a single factor matrix to optimize, and we really just get a series of linear least squares problems. And as a consequence, ALS achieves monotonic convergence, since at every step, it's kind of optimizing a subset of variables that in a way that guarantees the reduction of the residual over the previous iterate that we had. An alternative approach that is better in the sense that it can achieve a higher rate of convergence is the Gauss-Newton method, which optimizes all of the three-factor matrices at once by thinking about the overall problem as a nonlinear least squares problem and applying this kind of standard Gauss-Newton method. So I'll talk briefly about both of these and talk about a couple of ideas we have to accelerate these. So for alternating least squares, an idea that Lynch and my PhD student in our group came up with is that we can actually do it approximately in order to accelerate things when ALS is making little progress, which happens a lot. So a major problem with ALS is that it sometimes will get into regions where the convergence rate is kind of linear with a very kind of small coefficient. So it's making very small progress at a time. And so the factor matrices are changing little and the residual is going down slowly. But in this regime, we can actually leverage the fact that the factor matrices are changing little and do kind of a perturbative approximation of what ALS does to compute it approximately. So within alternating least squares, actually the dominant cost is the MTT-KRPs necessary to form the right-hand sides for each of the linear least squares problems once you view them actually in the normal equations corresponding to those linear least squares problems. So these MTT-KRPs, as you recall, are here at the bottom. They're the contraction, in this case, of an order 4 tensor with 3 factor matrices with 1 shared mode. So we need one of these for each one of the ALS subproblems. So our goal is to compute things at this bottom part of the tree. But we start with simply a tensor. And what we can do at first is compute a TTM, so contract the tensor with 1 matrix. And then we could reuse this TTM to compute multiple MTT-KRPs later. This is the idea of what's called the dimension tree algorithm, which tries to just amortize a few terms and saves about 3/2 in cost by not doing each MTT-KRP independently, but reusing TTMs. So we kind of realized that this idea of dimension trees can be extended and used to construct an approximation algorithm by not updating these intermediates. So we see that the most expensive part of MTT-KRP is this first TTM, and these subsequent lower parts are all low order in cost. And so what pairwise perturbation will do is to save all the intermediates at this last level in the tree before the MTT-KRPs. And in fact, it will compute somewhat more intermediates because we'll need more terms. And then it will propagate perturbations from each one of the updates we compute to the other right-hand sides. And so these updates are not quite accurate because to get the true update, we should recompute this term. But we won't recompute it, we'll just use an old one, and it will be a kind of a provably accurate approximation so long as the factor matrices don't change too much, which is the case we're interested in. And we can actually show that with this propagation of perturbations, kind of to first order, we get the desired accuracy, and we actually have a secondary correction that further improves the accuracy by trying to approximate the error term. For details on the numerics, please see our paper in archive. But the takeaway in terms of performance is that we go from a cost that's proportionate to the dimension to the nth power, where n is the order of the tensor. So this is the size of the tensor times the rank, to something that's quadratic in the dimension of the tensor times the rank. So this is actually independent of the order of the tensor. At least, well, there's like a constant prefactor there, but not a power of s to the n. And in practice, we observe large speedups for these approximated steps, such as in one case, a 33x speedup. Oh, and I forgot to talk about this plot. So here on the right, also, we compare ALS with a few different implementations, all of which are kind of comparable, except when working with very small dimension, to our pairwise perturbation algorithm, done using kind of a sequential NumPy code and using Cyclops, which is parallel, on a single, I think this is a single core, single node machine. And what we see is that as the dimension grows, we get a larger and larger speed up for this approximate step. And while Cyclops is smaller for small dimension due to kind of overheads of kind of a more complicated parallel system, it catches up for a larger dimension, despite at this point not using parallelism. And so we also later see that we can do this PP approximate in the parallel setting effectively as well. And to do it effectively in the parallel setting, there is an important optimization that kind of reduces communication costs substantially. And it stems from a similar idea in the ALS algorithm. So not the pairwise perturbation approximation, but simply the standard ALS when done in an efficient parallel way. And the idea is that if we're doing an MTT-KRP, the best way to do it in a parallel setting is to actually compute local MTT-KRPs with kind of some subset of the two matrices we're multiplying by, and whatever part of the tensor that's owned by a processor on a 3D processor grid, and then to do reductions to sum the results. And so this actually does a little bit of extra work, but it pushes a lot of the computation to be local. And in particular, we don't need to communicate intermediates such as that TTM that happens between the MTT-KRPs. So we can do the same thing with pairwise perturbation by applying pairwise perturbation not to the global MTT-KRP, but to the local MTT-KRPs. And this allows us to reduce communication for the contractions necessary for PP. And we kind of actually, from this change, we saw a huge speed up in the PP method for its parallel implementation. And we also now get even larger speedups in the parallel setting compared to standard methods for ALS. So here, DT is a dimension tree algorithm for ALS, which is kind of the state of the art that was around previously. And that's the blue line in these two plots. The MSDT is the multi-sweep dimension tree, which is kind of a simple idea that improves in computational cost over the dimension tree case that we described. And PP is our pairwise perturbation approximation. And as we see that sometimes actually doesn't get monotonic improvements in fitness, so up is good here, and it has some spikes down, but it corrects itself and converges faster to the same accuracy as obtained by these other methods. And I think on the left here, we have a case that's a quantum chemistry test problem that's high rank, and this is running on something like 16 nodes of Stampede 2. And on the right side here, we have a time-lapse data set, which is kind of an openly available tensor data set, which is a bit smaller, and I believe this is running simply a single node. Okay, so that's the PP idea. But instead of doing ALS, we mentioned that this Gauss-Newton method has a number of advantages. On the other hand, it's actually quite a lot more complicated for implementation. But due to its advantages, we decided to pursue kind of its analysis and efficient implementation in the parallel setting. And one really interesting thing we observed when playing around with Gauss-Newton algorithms is that they can actually sometimes find CP decompositions that are that have a better fitness than what the ALS algorithm can find, even if you give ALS many different starting points. And we can actually quantify this for the exact decomposition of a very small tensor, so just a 4x4x4 tensor. We can ask what will happen if we kind of generate a random tensor with a particular rank by generating the factors. So this is a tensor with an exact CP decomposition. And then we try to uncover that rank by starting with a random initial guess. So it turns out that somewhere where the rank is in this middle regime of 6 and 7, even if you use hundreds of iterations of ALS, there's a 0% probability of convergence, or at least 0 of 100 that we tried converged. While if you use Gauss-Newton, half of them converge to the right answer for these cases. And if you use Gauss-Newton with this varying regularization scheme, we do get better. So this is half, and here was 20%. And this varying regularization scheme is a new idea that Navjot came up with, who is a PhD student in our group. And the idea here is that we'll actually decrease the regularization parameter in a geometric fashion. And then once it hits a lower threshold, start increasing it in the geometric fashion until it hits an upper threshold, and so forth. So in a sense, we will oscillate this parameter, and this will actually allow us to do well in various regimes of optimization, because sometimes you want a small regularization, sometimes you want a large. And kind of by varying it, what we find is kind of consistent progress and good accuracy, as well as higher probability of finding exact solutions. So on the right here, we have a quantum chemistry problem with a fairly high rank. And we see that this Gauss-Newton with varying regularization converges very quickly to a very high fitness. ALS seems to stagnate at a much lower fitness. So this is something like 0.1% error, while this is 3% error. While Gauss-Newton with a fixed regularization converges much more slowly to maybe almost as good a fitness as our method of choice. So we see this consistently across many cases that Gauss-Newton, it has these problems. In particular, it's not guaranteed to converge monotonically. But if we actually let it hop around a bit at first, it will often quickly jump into a quadratic convergence regime and then kind of obtain quite high accuracy and converge. But implementing it is tricky. Actually, I thought I had a slide on that, but perhaps I'll have to talk about it in words. So what we actually have to do is, in Gauss-Newton, is to solve a linear system that's of number of degrees of freedom by number of degrees of freedom. And the number of degrees of freedom for an order 3 tensor is the combined size of all of the factor matrices. So that's kind of S times R, and solving that system in a naive dense way would cost S cubed R cubed. And that's potentially a lot bigger than ALS, which has a cost of S cubed R per iteration. So what we actually do is to solve that system implicitly. So to never actually form this matrix, that's number of degrees of freedom by number of degrees of freedom, that is kind of our Gauss-Newton Hessian, but to only compute Hessian matrix vector products, and to do those via tensor contractions, and then to parallelize those tensor contractions via Cyclops. So this is how we get an efficient parallel implementation of this method, which we believe is the first parallel implementation of a Gauss-Newton method for CP decomposition. And the idea of this implicit solve is based on this 2013 paper by Tichovsky, Fan, and Kichoki. Okay, and I wanted to actually talk a little bit briefly about the sparse case. I think I just have one slide for today on this to demonstrate a little bit of kind of what we're working on and already have in Cyclops. So for the sparse MTT KRP, so namely when T is sparse and V and W are dense, which is typically the case if we're doing a tensor decomposition of a sparse tensor, it turns out that contracting these all at once is a lot faster than contracting a pair of them and then the final 2 tensors. This is something that was to some degree surprising for us as as Cyclops developers. Cyclops kind of originally would aim to do contraction of 2 tensors at a time as efficiently as possible. And we've optimized it quite well. We can do it for the dense case. We can handle sparse matrix formats and actually hypersparse matrix formats too, which are efficient for tensors that are extremely sparse. So here, this plot is going to sparser and sparser tensors with a fixed number of non-zeros. So here, something like 1 in every 2 to the 27 entries is non-zero. So this is extremely sparse. And in this case, if you try to actually look at any kind of matrix-like representation of the tensor, a standard compressed sparse row CSR format is really bad. And what one should do is use a hypersparse format that doesn't store any information for rows that are entirely 0. So we've implemented that in the CTF, and that allows us to scale to sparser tensors. So the non-hypersparse version kind of runs out of steam here due to being out of memory. But if we actually compare that to contracting everything all at once, which can be done efficiently by iterating over the sparse entries or simply looking at the sparse entries owned by every processor and contracting with the desired entries of V and W to compute the desired contributions to U, this performs a lot faster. So that's the blue line here by multiple orders of magnitude. Our implementation for that is competitive with, or actually a bit slower by a factor of 2 to 3 than the Splat library, which kind of was the first to implement MTT KRP in this way and is highly optimized, while we're more general and redistribute tensors, but also allow a lot more operations than a simple MTT KRP to happen with the tensors and reach kind of nearly the same performance. And we're kind of currently working toward developing a broader set of multi-tensor kernels. In fact, we already have several others, and looking at their applications in sparse tensor decompositions, sparse tensor completion, and graph algorithms. Okay, with that, so it's 11:42. So actually, I think I will skip these 2 slides since I'm going a lot slower than expected on symmetry. So maybe I'll summarize in one sentence that we have a recent paper that provides a more computationally efficient algorithm for contraction of symmetric tensors, and is based on kind of this view of bilinear algorithms and computing things and subtracting out redundant terms in order to lower cost. A yet more recent paper that we've developed tries to look at ways in which conservation laws, which manifest themselves as group symmetries in tensors, can be leveraged in order to reduce cost without creating kind of systems complications. So for a long time in quantum chemistry and tensor network methods, and kind of still now, people care a lot about how to leverage different types of group symmetry, and typically do it by working with block sparse tensor representations. And so for many years, people have asked me to develop kind of a block sparse extension to Cyclops. Currently, we handle kind of general sparsity, but it's not the most efficient way to handle block sparsity. And I'm lazy and didn't want to do it. So instead, we came up with this idea of trying to kind of work with these symmetries without going to a block sparse tensor, by instead actually working with the irreducible representation of the tensor, which kind of gives us a reduced form that's a dense tensor, and then kind of transforming that tensor in a new clever way so that we can actually contract and compute contractions with an arbitrary conservation law symmetry. And these diagrams kind of try to give some intuition for what's going on. In a sense, we introduce a kind of a new index. We transform this reduced form so that when we actually contract two tensors, the conservation law can kind of be captured using this new index. And so for more details, again, please refer to our paper on that. Okay, so with that quick jump over for symmetry, I wanted to get back to talking a little bit about tensor networks, and then talk about some of the system software that we've designed to accelerate such methods. So a quantum circuit actually is basically a tensor network. So we can kind of think about a representation of a quantum circuit that looks like this in terms of a tensor network that starts with, in this case, a product state or an MPS or tensor train with a rank 1, then applies kind of a local contraction of each site in the tensor, then applies kind of a two-state, this kind of more complicated two, these are often called sites. So this is a two-site gate operator. And so this is, again, can be modeled as a tensor contraction. And so if you actually contract this, this network, in a sense, you can compute what the quantum circuit will compute. And while the description in the tensor network can be quite succinct, the contraction of the tensor network can actually require exponential cost relative to the initial description, because in a sense, the bond dimensions of the intermediates will grow. So there's still a challenge here. But why would we want to do this? I mean, quantum computers should execute quantum circuits. Why are we talking about simulating them with tensor networks? Well, there's actually a good number of reasons. One thing is that if we can efficiently simulate quantum algorithms, we can kind of enable better development, testing, and tuning of such algorithms. Another thing that's of interest to approximately simulating these systems is to understand the degree to which we actually need a quantum computer to compute a particular circuit. So if there is actually an effective approximation to all the intermediate states that you get when contracting the circuit classically, then we could do it efficiently classically. And another reason is that in doing classical simulation, we can work with various models of noise and error, and to actually try to understand how near-term quantum architectures will behave in the presence of these problems. And finally, in a sense, tensor networks may pave a way toward hybrid quantum classical algorithms, since if the main way that kind of we could hope to design quantum classical algorithms is to communicate circuit descriptions between the classical machine to the quantum machine. And the tensor network formalism allows us to kind of optimize these circuit descriptions as tensor networks in a classical way. So Cyclops was actually utilized to do a very large quantum circuit simulation in just an exact and non-approximate way by a team of IBM and Lawrence Livermore researchers back in 2017, I believe. And actually more recently by a team primarily from China and Singapore, I believe, for simulation with this 2D tensor network, or a PEPS, where they did it exactly. So our group has been working on ways to do simulation of quantum circuits in an approximate setting. And so the way we do it is via what's called tensor network states. So the classical approach to simulating a tensor network, the kind of the most naive approach, is to use what's called a state vector. And so this is a tensor, and each mode is size 2. And so this is kind of representing a 4-qubit state. So its size is 2 to the power of the number of qubits. So if you have too many qubits, you're not going to be able to store this. But if you have this, then each of these gates can be modeled as a simple contraction over a couple of modes that transforms it over those modes. So that these are the tensor diagrams we would compute for that circuit. So instead, what we could do is to realize that typically the state that we start at for a quantum algorithm is the product state. And that can be modeled via essentially any tensor network. But as we progress and compute the contractions, it helps to think about some kind of tensor network that represents the state vector and that transforms through time as we apply gates. And so that's the notion of a tensor network state. So here we would want to apply this single qubit gate to just this one site, this 2 qubit gate to the 2 sites, and then refactorize them to get back to a matrix product state. So this tensor train-like factorization, and then continue. And so there's been work on simulating quantum circuits with matrix product states, especially in the sequential setting, which have also shown that often you can do it approximately with smaller bond dimension, and what results kind of looks like a noisy quantum circuit. So it's kind of a reasonable simulation. What we focus on is the projected entangled pair state, or this 2D tensor network state, and we try to simulate this and the gates that are applied to nearby qubits in this 2D tensor network. And the reason we want to use this model is because kind of emerging near-term quantum architectures often look like 2D grids, or kind of have a 2D layout in terms of connectivity between qubits and the gates you're allowed to apply. So within this framework of simulation, the most important step is the application of gates and the subsequent refactorization. Well, actually, this is one of 2 most important steps. I'll mention the other one shortly. Although both of them have a similar substructure. So here, what we want to do is to contract a few things and then kind of compute an SVD to break them up in order to compute the next iterate of this matrix product state or PEPS state. And to do that efficiently, we can actually leverage a QR factorization of these factors, where we form these R factors and then apply the gate to the R factors and then refactorize these 2. And this reduces cost actually asymptotically because this QR factorization, in a sense, is of a column vector-like matrix, but poses some challenges for parallelization since QR is not all that parallel. So we found kind of a better way to implement this, and kind of did it as part of an abstraction that we call einsam SVD, which is a general operation for contracting a bunch of tensors and then refactorizing them as a product of 2 tensors. And the idea is that there's actually a number of alternative algorithms one could use to perform einsam SVD. One of them is to leverage QR decompositions in order to reduce cost. And another one of them is to use a randomized SVD. So in general, this einsam SVD operation says that, okay, we have some set of tensors we want to contract, and then we want to refactorize that. And so a naive way to do things is to just contract everything together and then matricize the result and do SVD of that. However, this is often not the most efficient route. So for example, instead, we could do a randomized SVD approach, which tries to guess what one of these factors is. And kind of the bottleneck there would be the contraction of one of these factors with this original tensor network, which often has asymptotically less cost depending on the structure of this tensor network. So we've kind of implemented the general abstraction for this, and on top of that, this PEPS simulation library. So the other major issue with PEPS is that if we actually want to kind of calculate something like an expectation value, or kind of actually get some information out of our tensor network state, what we need to do is to contract it with itself or with another PEPS. And that means that we match up all these modes and we get this tensor network with no more physical legs, the result of which is actually a scalar. However, contracting 2 PEPS like this with some constant bond dimension actually has exponential cost and is known to be Sharp-P complete. So in a sense, if we are able to do it with less cost, we can actually solve a number of other problems with less cost too. So the way that this is typically done is with boundary contraction, or this boundary MPS contraction method, which in a sense starts at the top left corner and then slides along and contracts everything in the top row, then the next row, and the next row. And all that method really does is a sequence of einsam SVDs. So we demonstrated that using our primitive and then kind of an efficient randomized SVD, we can get kind of the desired asymptotic cost using a simpler approach than previously known methods. Okay, and these methods and algorithms for Einsam SVD and kind of PEPS simulation are a part of a library called Koala. Yu-Chen Peng, who's a PhD student in LPNA as well, kind of is leading development of that. Although the work was done with a number of other students in the group. So Tianyi, Annika, and Yiqing are now at Stanford, Caltech, and Cornell, all doing their PhD studies there. What the Koala library does is to use some kind of backend, for example, Cyclops, but also it's capable of using a simple single GPU or simple NumPy backend. And it is able to generate quantum states that are then represented as a PEPS, as well as to apply operators such as gates, but not necessarily quantum gates, so they need not be unitary operators. And we can also do other types of tensor network simulation methods, which we evaluate in this archive paper. But I will give you a little bit of the results that we talk about there. One thing we study is the extent to which we achieve strong scalability for evolution. So that's application of a gate to a tensor network state, as well as contraction, which is the contraction of two PEPs. And we see that for both operations, we achieve a reasonably good strong scalability, although as usual, at some point we level off. And as we go to higher problems, we do this better. We get worse scalability for evolution because it's less computationally intensive. For contraction, there is a higher flop to byte ratio, so we scale somewhat better. We also try to measure the error that this PEPS-based simulation method gets if you try to use it to simulate Google's random quantum circuit benchmark, which is a circuit that's designed to be very difficult to approximate and is intended to demonstrate, in a sense, a faster speed of a quantum machine over a classical machine. So this is kind of a adversarial problem for our simulator. And we see that as we increase the PEPS bond dimension, if we're working with a small enough PEPS, so with a small number of qubits, we eventually jump to near perfect accuracy, in a sense, because our intermediate bond dimension gets high enough for the circuit. But also we get improved accuracy. So we get 1 digit of accuracy if we use sufficient bond dimension, even for very large circuits. So for example, a 7 by 7 49 qubit circuit is essentially the frontier of what's been simulated to date exactly. And we're doing it here with a fairly small number of nodes of STAMP2. But by doing things approximately. And actually this one significant digit of accuracy is meaningful from a quantum algorithm simulation perspective. So you get kind of meaningful fidelity, and you can use that to kind of boost things and actually calculate interesting stuff. So the fact that we get some degree of improved accuracy is a great sign. So one of our major goals was also try to understand the degree to which we can simulate near-term potential quantum algorithms, one of which is the variational quantum eigensolver. And it's near-term in the sense that it is a very low-depth circuit that's needed. And at the same time, it's actually solving a very important problem. So it's trying to compute the ground state of a Hamiltonian for a quantum electronic system or with either fermions or other types of particles. So, and what we see for this VQ simulation is that we get improved accuracy generally with higher rank, although we also do get a lot of noise. So this rank 4 case kind of does best in the limit, but the rank 1 case also does fairly well. And so we're continuing to kind of study this now for somewhat larger circuits. So these were fairly small experiments we did. We actually do quite a lot better if we try to approximately calculate a method which is called imaginary time evolution, which is actually not a quantum algorithm, but simply a classical tensor network simulation method. And so our code kind of does that in a very natural way and achieves good scalability. And the higher rank we go to, the closer we get to the accuracy of a state vector simulation, which is much more expensive. So in a sense, what we're able to demonstrate is improvable accuracy with higher bond dimension, which was kind of one of the major hypotheses. And we achieve a good scalability for these methods, for which very little kind of software exists in the open domain. And primarily, these methods have been studied in physics. Okay, and I'm quite behind on time, but the final thing I wanted to talk about today is automatic differentiation for tensor computations. So in a sense, all the methods I've talked about so far, so these tensor decomposition algorithms such as Gauss-Newton and ALS, the DMRG method for tensor networks, all of these are applying Newton's method, so quadratic approximation, to a subset of the variables at a time in an alternating manner. And Newton's method, in a sense, to do this quadratic approximation simply needs to compute a bunch of derivatives and then to solve a linear system. So in principle, we should be able to use automatic differentiation to just automatically generate the desired methods, given a description of the objective function that we're trying to minimize for the overall tensor network. However, if you kind of go in and try to do that with existing AD tools, which kind of some of our collaborators in chemistry and physics have tried to do, one runs into major bottlenecks in memory and computational cost. And the reason is that these tools are really not focused and haven't thought about how to make efficient AD for these complicated settings when you have very large tensors and these kind of alternating optimization schemes that require very clever formation of intermediates. Typically, they've kind of been focusing on what happens in deep learning and the tensors that arise there. And within deep learning, there's kind of a more regular structure that you can differentiate along, where there's not as much need to save large intermediates or optimize intermediate expressions. Also the actual tensors that typical neural networks work with are fairly small, because ultimately one is trying to train a model that is typically then used on a fairly small device, such as an embedded system. So while in some of the tensor decomposition benchmarks and algorithms and problems that we want to solve, the tensors are massive in size. And also for these tensor network simulations, even the factors get extremely big and do not fit on a single node of a system. So you need both parallelization as well as smarter knowledge of intermediates, as well as some linear algebra. So there are certain identities that arise within the tensor decomposition methods and kind of derivation of efficient methods that an AD engine needs to understand in order to generate efficient code. One example is that if you want to invert a Kronecker product, we can actually invert the two operands of the Kronecker product. So if the matrices here are n by n, this inverse would cost n to the 6, while these cost n cubed. So we reduce the asymptotic complexity of this massively. And this type of transformation happens within derivation of things like ALS methods for CP decomposition. So AutoHoot, which was developed by Linjin Ma and Xiaoyu Ye. Linjin is a PhD student in our group, and Xiaoyu is actually a friend of Linjin's who is currently at Google. So AutoHoot does exactly what I described. It provides kind of a higher level abstraction that's naturally targeting tensor computations such as tensor networks and tensor decompositions. And it does it at the Python level without any compiler support. So it's kind of generating expressions in a sense on the fly, and also optimizing the expressions in a clever way that's targeted at tensor computations and makes use of the identities that you need. And the result is that for CP decomposition, if we compare, we actually don't compare to JAX or TensorFlow because they're so slow that we can't put them on the plot for this type of method. But we could compare to existing tensor decomposition libraries in Python, just running here on a single CPU. And AutoHoot is actually faster. So even kind of hand-optimized code, we do better than. And we do much, much better than for these types of problems than the best alternative, which is JAX. And also, and to me, this was kind of really amazing for DMRG. So this is comparing the time for a Hessian vector product for the QUIM library, which is kind of the state-of-the-art library for tensor networks in DMRG, where the code is handwritten, to AutoHoot, which is our library. And this is using a GPU. So QUIM can also make use of GPUs. AutoHoot can make use of GPUs, CPUs, or CTFs, so distributed memory systems as well. And we see that for small problems, we actually do better. And for large problems, we get the same performance. And if we look at overall DMRG performance, AutoHoot actually does very slightly worse than QUIM, but essentially the same. And so overall, what we get is that AutoHoot can automatically generate code that is as efficient at figuring out what the right intermediates to amortize are for methods like DMRG and for tensor decompositions. And in DMRG, the sequence of intermediates is quite complex. So this is quite a feat in my view. OK. And so that's kind of the end of my talk. I wanted to kind of flash this slide again to remind everybody what's going on. So we have these applications ranging from simulation of quantum systems to data analysis, as well as graph processing is something you can do with tensors. And we talked about new software abstractions, in particular Koala and AutoHoot, which are built on top of the Cyclops library for distributed tensor contractions and enable kind of an HPC execution style environment for all of these applications using very high-level abstractions for their implementation, AutoHoot can, in a sense, immediately generate tensor decomposition methods using minimal code. Okay, and with that, I'd just like to thank kind of all the folks in my group, as well as the NSF funding we've gotten to for this research, and Stampede 2, which we've been using for our experiments as of late. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you very much, Edgar, for the wonderful talk. We have time for a few questions, I think. But before that, I do want to give a brief advertisement for our next SPCL BCast talk, which will be on the 5th of November, 9 a.m. Zurich time, where Jidong Zhai of Tsinghua will be talking about lightweight performance analysis for next generation HPC systems.